Okay. All right. We're recording now. Okay,
Okay.
so let's get started again. So thanks everybody. My name is Cary Rivard. And should we do quick introductions of the other people on the other side of the screen
Yeah,
too?
that's great. So that way they know who's there.
That's
Yep.
right. So Ward, do you want to introduce?
Okay. Yep. So I'm Ward Upham. You've already met me. I've already taught that class earlier before. So good to see all of you again.
And I'm Cheryl Boyer, and I've met you too, and it's exciting to be able to be on this end and see how it goes. So enjoy, you guys. Feel free to ask questions. We can hear you. So if you need to raise your hand, just let us know. And Carrie's got it all planned out, so we'll just let him go.
All right. Well, we'll see how it goes. So if you haven't figured it out already, this is kind of a new thing, doing the distance education for the Master Gardener trainings. And I've done a fair number of distance education webinars and stuff like that. And they usually go fine. This is definitely the only one I've ever done that's 3 hours long. So we wanted to put some thought into how to kind of frame it and how it's going to work. And we appreciate your all's patience and willingness to be kind of guinea pigs on this wonderful experience that is the new digital age. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? Let me just share my screen here. Hopefully this will pull up a PowerPoint. Can everybody see that okay? All right. Well, I assume that means you can. So
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, we can see it.
So we're going to be talking about vegetables today. And what I thought we would do, since it is sort of this online venue, rather than having a big 3 hour long session, or usually what we do is split it into 2 sessions that are fairly long. What I've done is I've split it into 4 45-minute sessions. And what I'm hoping to do is go through about 25 to 30 slides, depending on the session. I'll probably go through those pretty quickly. I think you guys have handouts there, so feel free to take any notes. But because I can't really see you very well, we're going to wait for all the questions till the end. And what we're going to do is at the end of each, 30 to 35-minute presentation, we'll have another 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And so if anybody there, wants to get up and use the restroom or get a snack or get some water, any of those question and answer times would be a great time to do that. I probably personally will take a quick little break away from the computer at some point halfway in between or so as well. But there's not going to be sort of a big 20-minute break where everybody goes to the bathroom and socializes. So feel free to just do that during the questions time. You're not going to offend me one bit, and we'll just see how it goes from there. So we're talking about vegetables today. I'm going to do my best to tell you everything I know about vegetables. But the first thing we need to really figure out if we're going to be master gardeners is what is a vegetable. And it's kind of a complicated story. If those of you that don't know in the room, vegetables don't really have a botanical description like fruit do. We often think about vegetables and fruit being the two, major horticultural food crops. But the reality is that it's hard to define them that way because fruit really has a botanical definition, right? It's the ovary of a seed-bearing plant. But vegetables, if you think about it, they don't really have a specific definition. And they come from all types of tissues. We have vegetables that come from roots like sweet potatoes and carrots. We have vegetables that come from stems like potatoes and onions. And we also have vegetables that come from leaves like lettuce, of course, and flowers like broccoli and cauliflower. So it's not really a specific tissue of the plant that really defines something as a vegetable, which makes it a little bit confusing. Because we do actually have vegetables that are botanically considered a fruit. So we call these fruiting vegetables. And these are most of the ones that people really like to eat a bunch, things like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and stuff like that. Eggplant would be a fruiting vegetable. Squash, actually pumpkins, would be a fruiting vegetable. So it's a little bit confusing if you think about it in that way in the perspective of how fruit are defined. So this whole thing got so interesting in its definition that it went all the way up to the Supreme Court back in the late 1800s. And the Supreme Court actually defined what a vegetable is. And it has nothing to do with botany or the tissue types or anything like fruits are. Vegetables are defined by how and when you eat them. In other words, the culinary use of that plant. So they define it as a plant or plant part that is eaten with or before the main part of the meal. So as you go marching out into the world as master gardeners, you can now define exactly what a vegetable is, and its interesting definition by the Supreme Court. And it's kind of interesting if you think about it, so, since I've started giving this training, I now realize that avocados are probably vegetables, right? They look like fruit to me, but they probably are vegetables. So think about that on your way home today. Now, as we start talking about vegetables, we can basically group them into two different types of crops. We have cool season crops and we have warm season crops. And here in Kansas, we plant cool season crops in the spring, usually around the 15th of March, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, depending on the weather. And then they'll go through into middle or late May, sometimes even early June if we're having a cool summer. And then we can also grow cool season crops in the fall. And that's actually the most ideal time to plant cool season crops for most species in Kansas, because one of the things that's good about growing cool season crops in the fall is that you're going into cool nighttime temperatures. And so that's going to really help reduce the stress on the plant, but it's also going to really increase the flavor and reduce the likelihood that you're going to have bitter crops, especially with things like lettuce and other leafy greens. If you can move those things into cooler nighttime temperatures, you're going to have better quality produce. So here in Kansas, because we tend to get really erratic weather in April and May, we tend to have better luck with cool season crops in the fall, although they also do very well in the spring as well too. But your two main planting dates for those cool season crops is March 15th, and then usually about August 15th. It's really going to depend on the species. If it's a long-term crop, you can plant lettuce, up till September 15th or so. Now, warm season crops are the things most of us are already growing in the garden, things like your tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, all that stuff that's sensitive to frost, right? But in general, we kind of talk about vegetables in these two main classes of crops, like most plants as well, too. So what are we going to be talking about today? As I mentioned, we've got 4 basic sessions. And of course, I'm already like 20 minutes behind on the first one, but we'll see how this goes. In the first session, we're going to talk a little bit about where a garden is going to go, how you're going to put together a crop rotation, and quite a bit about soil improvement. One of the things to keep in mind with vegetable gardening is that it's very intensive on the soil. Most vegetable crops are annuals. We're getting in there with tillers and hoes and having to harvest them and walk through there and work the soil and all that stuff. And that's very hard on the soil. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we're always being very proactive at increasing the quality and the health of the soil by using a lot of organic matter and compost and other things. So we're going to talk about that for the next 30 minutes or so. Now, in terms of where to put the garden, most of us don't have much of a choice, right? It tends to be wherever you have that specific spot in the yard. But do keep in mind, if you have the ability or if you're out looking for a community garden plot, that you want to find places with very well-drained soils. As I mentioned before, growing vegetables is an intensive process. You're getting in there and working the soil a lot. You're harvesting all the time, doing all this kind of stuff. And so if it's a muddy mess, not only is it going to be, a pain in the rear to deal with, but it's also going to be hard on the soil to work it when it's wet. So you want it to be able to dry quickly so that in case you have to do anything with it. And it's also what the plant's like as well. There's not really any of our major vegetable crop species really like, heavy waterlogged soils. So we want to make sure they're well drained. For home gardening, a lot of times, things to keep an eye out for if people ask you for advice is stuff like gutter downspouts and driveways that run off into a small garden plot next to the the driveway or the garage. Things like that you want to be careful for, because if you're getting a lot of water into an area, that's going to be really hard on those vegetable crops. The other thing is going to be looking out for trees, of course. Now, we don't have a huge problem with that in Kansas, but don't forget that most all of our vegetable crop species do want full sun. And so when we talk about full sun, we're really talking about afternoon sun from noon to 4 p.m. If you're getting sun only in the morning, that really only consists as part sun, and it doesn't matter if you're a vegetable plant or an impatient. That's sort of the way it goes. So you want to make sure if it's on the side of a house or a structure, it's on the south or the west exposure, and make sure that it's getting plenty of sun in those afternoon hours. Now, there are a few vegetable crops that will do okay in some partial shade, but typically you don't want to be looking for fruiting vegetables in this case, because many of the plants that have to go through the pollination process really need full sun. But for leafy greens and some of those others where you're just, especially for leafy vegetables, you can get away with a little bit of shade. Last but not least, you do want to be careful about walnut trees. If you didn't know, Jason can tell you there's a really nice extension publication through K-State about walnut wilt of tomato. And walnuts actually exude a chemical known as juglans that is toxic to the plants around it. And it does this as a natural response in order to be competitive in the landscape. But unfortunately, many of our vegetable crops are very sensitive to it. So if you have walnut trees around, that can be a real significant issue. So you figured out where you want to put your garden. The next thing you want to do is determine what your crop rotation is going to be. And I think most of us know why we want to utilize crop rotation in terms of reducing diseases and increasing soil fertility. However, one thing to keep in mind that I think there's a sort of common misperception out there about crop rotation is in terms of managing diseases, it's really most helpful for soil-borne diseases, and in other words, root diseases and things that live in the soil and attack the root system and the stem of the plant. If you start talking about foliar blights and leaf spots and viruses, those kinds of the pathogens that cause those diseases fly around in the air. So it doesn't really matter if your tomato is here or 100 feet away, it's most likely going to get affected by that pathogenic disease. But there's a lot of pathogens that cause what we call soil-borne diseases. And those are ones like damping off and root rots and vascular wilt diseases. And a lot of those can be reduced by using crop rotation. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that when you're rotating crops, you want to rotate in entire plant families, not individual crop species. Because oftentimes these soil-borne plant pathogens not only attack a tomato, but also their close cousin, the pepper, right? So this is a table that shows basically all those different plant families within vegetables. And there are some that aren't listed here. This is a table I actually pulled off of the internet, and I must be the first to admit there is a mistake. If you look, it has lettuce listed in the brassicas, and it should not be there. Lettuce is actually in its own family down in the bottom left at the Asteraceae. But this basically lists the general plant families. Your Alliaceae, these are the ones that drive our vampires away, the garlic and onions and other stem and bulb crops. Brassicas, we used to call these coal crops, your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, those kinds of things, and those are cool season crops. Cucurbits are warm season crops, and this is going to be, if you've ever had a squash bug come on your property, it's probably that because you're growing a cucurbit somewhere around there. They really love those guys. And then our legumes, the Fabaceae crops, those are going to be your sugar snap peas and your bush beans. And then, of course, my favorite plant family, the solanaceous plant family. So that's your tomatoes, Irish potatoes, green peppers, and eggplant. And then the ones at the bottom there are kind of handy. They all are within their own plant family, so it makes it a lot easier to rotate. So the first thing that you want to do is develop the rotation. And so you want to actually essentially draw out your garden and divide it into equivalent area zones or blocks. And in this diagram here, this is really just a conceptual diagram. It's not a physical map, but it's just sort of a way to show how I put together a crop rotation. So in my case, I took my garden, excuse me, and I'll show that to you here in a second. And it was about a 30 by 35 foot garden, right? And I divided it into 8 zones, okay? And you're gonna find out here in a few minutes why we chose the number 8. 8 is a good number to start with. It can be more. I don't know if you want it to be less. It just kind of depends on what you want to grow. So I've got my 8 zones, and these all have equivalent square footage. And I go ahead and basically assign plant families to each of those zones. So you can see in the first zone, we've got the solanaceous family, and then our brassicas, and then our cucurbits, and then our fabaceous family. And then looky here, we have solanaceous again, right? So this is one of the reasons that it's good to have 8 blocks or maybe even more, is because I like to grow a lot of tomatoes, right? I want to have peppers, I want to have potatoes. I really like those solanaceous crops. And so I want to be able to dedicate twice the square footage into growing that crop that I do the others. So I can assign 2 blocks to that solanaceous plant family. Similarly, I assign 2 blocks to the cucurbit family, right? You can see that as well too. And the reason we do that is, well, there's lots of reasons. Cucurbits take a lot of space up. They're also something that are very popular, easy to give away with the neighbors, of course. But oftentimes I like to plant several plantings of cucurbit crops, especially cucumbers, so that we can have sustained harvest through the course of the season. So I want to have lots of space to work with for my cucurbits. So this is essentially what the garden would look like in year 1. In year 2, you basically just pull your sweet potatoes out of zone 8, move it to zone 1, and then just scoot everybody over, right? And from this point on, the crop rotation is fairly simple and straightforward. The nice thing about planning is then you can just stop thinking. And in year 3, you basically take what was in zone 8, put it in zone 1, scoot everybody over, and you now have yourself an official crop rotation. So looking at this diagram, it's interesting because there's actually 2 different rotation intervals here. You may have remembered from that slide before that we want to have a 3-year crop rotation interval. But actually in this diagram, what you're seeing is that in this garden, we have a 4-year crop rotation interval for the solanaceous crops. And can you guys see my pointer? Yes? Okay, never mind.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it? Okay, great. That's awesome.
Yep.
Okay, so you can see we have a 4-year crop rotation for these solanaceous guys and for the cucurbits. And we have an 8-year crop rotation for the other ones. So that's sort of how that could work. Now, this would be an actual map of what this garden looked like. So this was just a personal garden I had in my backyard. And you can see it's about a 30 by 30 foot garden. And those 8 zones were basically just 8 rows, essentially. So is that how you can do that? And in my case, I wanted my 2 tomato rows next to each other. So you can just move them 2 blocks at a time, essentially, in order to accomplish what you want to. But depending on how you design the garden, there's lots of sort of creative ways to leapfrog around itself. This is what's called the Florida or California stake and weave trellis system for tomatoes. It's fairly common if you're going to have a decent sized garden, and especially if you're growing determinate varieties, some of those shorter stature varieties. But it's not for all home gardeners. We like to use cages here in Kansas. They're a little bit more tolerant of wind. And I also like cages if you're going to have a lower plant number. So this diagram comes out of Elliot Coleman's book called The New Organic Grower. And it's actually getting fairly old. That book was written about 20 years ago. But Elliot Coleman is a very prolific writer. He's put a lot of books out about season extension and sort of small farm tools and that kind of stuff. He's an organic grower up in Maine, and he actually works a lot with Johnny's Seed Company, if any of y'all have ever bought seeds from them, and sells his tools through Johnny's. But one of the things that's cool about the way he's done this is he also has 8 zones here. And then he's got his years listed across the top. And you could actually imagine a really nice Excel sheet where you could do something really easily like that, right? And what's cool about it is we're going to be talking about cover crops here in a few minutes. But he's actually got his vegetable crops on the top right there and his cover crops on the bottom. And so doing it this way, you can actually map out year by year how you're going to put that crop rotation together, because it does start getting a little overwhelming if you start thinking about it through the course of summer, fall, spring crops. So this is a nice way to look at it too. But, don't forget, gardening's supposed to be fun. So if this, just makes your eyes hurt, then it's okay. You can just close the book and go out in the garden. The other thing I just thought I would mention, especially since for those of you out near Salina may or may not have some space, but don't forget, another nice way to increase your crop rotation interval is to actually move the garden. And if you have enough room to do something like this, there's a lot of people that have been real successful where they rotate it within a small garden for 4 or 5 years or 6 years, and then they actually move it to another spot for 4 or 5 or 6 years, and then move it to another spot. And if anybody's playing around with, small livestock or pasture poultry or something like that, you can integrate some of those systems in there as well too. But this is a really nice way to drastically increase your crop rotation interval. And there's been some really cool research done that has shown when you actually cut in these perennial grasses, like are very common in Kansas in pastures, all the roots and the microbes that live under those perennial grasses really help benefit those plants. And so you can get really good production out of your vegetables that way. Just a quick note on soils too. Don't forget to do soil testing. Most of our vegetable crops want, in your manual it says 6.5 to 7.0. You could even go a little bit lower than that in case you put too much sulfur on. But you want it just a little bit on the acidic side of neutral for most vegetables. So for most of us, that means we need to add sulfur. And there's a really nice table in your manual that shows you how much sulfur to add per 100 square feet. And it is a good idea to make sure you're doing your soil testing, certainly if not every year, every other year. Now, one of the primary things that we want to do to help improve the soil in the vegetable garden is to add organic matter, right? So organic matter is basically going to be carbon-based materials that's going to go into the soil, and it's going to start getting chewed up by all these microbes, bacteria and fungi and other things that live in the soil ecosystem. And as those bacteria and microbes chew up that organic matter, they're going to spit out this stuff called glomalin, which is basically this sugary-like substance that helps hold soil particles together. And when they hold these particles together, they form these things called aggregates. And what soil aggregation does is it allows the plant to actually extract water off of those soil particles more efficiently than they do without it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But just don't forget that adding organic matter is very important, and it's very helpful, not only as a way to improve the porosity and some of the physical parameters of the soil, but also to help feed the microbes that live in that soil, and also to help support the plant growth. So we can add organic matter in lots of different ways. One of the most common ways in vegetable gardens is with compost, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But there's a lot of alternatives to compost that I like to talk about during this training, and so we'll mention some of those as well too, both here and in the second session. So I mentioned before this whole thing of soil aggregation, and we're not going to talk too much about it. I know you guys have had your soils class, and we don't want to get into too much detail. But one of the things to keep in mind is that healthy soil helps protect your crops from drought. Because on a typical year, you may have, say this is the soil moisture level through the course of the year. And this is just a little drawing I made. This is not actual data or anything like that, but it's fairly typical for what we see. We have pretty high soil moisture content, maybe get some rains in June, and then July, the drought starts, right? And then you get to August and the drought really hits, right? So during this time, you want to be able to keep those plants alive and be able to withstand some extended periods of low water availability, right? Especially down in this range when we get into sort of the hot part of the season. Now, if you have poor and compacted soils, soils that have low organic matter and don't have a lot of microbial life to them, then they're going to have poor aggregate structure. And so the availability of that water to those plants is going to be limited compared to a healthy soil, right? If you have healthy soils, then those plant roots are going to be able to pull that water away from the soil particles more efficiently and easier. And so they actually have higher water availability even during periods of lower soil moisture content. So as I mentioned before, one of the best ways to add organic matter is by using compost. And if you have a vegetable garden, you're going to find you're going to want to have a compost bin somewhere on the property, if nothing else, just because you have all these yard scraps and garden scraps coming out of the garden. And so you're going to have to find something to do with them. We don't really want to put that stuff in the landfill. That's a heck of a lot of bulk material that can easily be composted and be put back into the garden to use for nutrients and organic matter. So I really encourage you to, even if it's a small primitive thing, have some type of compost pile in your yard somewhere that you can hide from the neighbors, and get rid of your extra plant material, both when you clean out the garden and also during harvest time, because you're always going to have fruit, that aren't super high quality and stuff like that. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with the process of making compost, and we're not really going to go into many of the details today. But one thing that I really wanted to point out is that it's important that compost gets really warm, when it's going through that decomposition process. And the reason that it's really important to do this is because when it gets hot like that, it's going to help kill or inactivate weed seeds or potential pathogens, things that get into the compost pile that we don't want to be there, right? So you want to make sure that there's plenty of nitrogen availability in your compost. If you have the ability to collect your grass clippings every once in a while and put it in your compost pile, boy, that is a really, really great source of high nitrogen material that makes really nice compost. And you want to make sure that you're turning it and paying attention to it. The other thing to keep in mind is that, there's no such thing as overly mature compost. And this is just a little diagram that I pulled out of an old paper somewhere. And basically what it shows is that the efficacy of the decomposition process is not only a function of the temperature, but also the exposure time, right, by those microbes or those pathogen spores and weed seeds. So if you're not sure if the compost is ready, just let it go a little bit longer. As I mentioned, there's nothing wrong with overly mature compost. So there's lots of benefits of using compost. I think many of us are familiar with what those are. In addition to feeding the microbes that live in the soil, if you're buying compost in, especially high quality compost, it's also sort of an inoculation source, right, for those microbes to bring some of those really good microbes into the garden. I know most of us realize that there's all these bacteria and fungi that attack plants, right, and cause plant diseases. But there's also a lot of really good ones as well, too. And there's a whole field of research going on now looking at especially bacteria, but also some fungi that live on the root systems of plants. And what they do is they turn on endogenous defense pathways, kind of similar to the immune system in our bodies. But they also can help release nutrients and make them available. There's also fungi that live in the soil that attack other pathogens as well. So there's a lot of really good microbes that can come in through that compost. And so that's one of the things that I really think is the best benefit of using compost that you can't get from anywhere else. The other nice thing about using compost, and especially manure-based compost, is it's a great source of plant nutrients. There's a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus as well as other things, sometimes too much, and micronutrients as well too. So many organic farmers and gardeners use compost or manure-based compost, especially as a plant nutrient source. Excuse me. There are a lot of disadvantages or cons about compost as well too, and these are things that people don't talk a lot about, quite frankly. But the reality is anytime you move any large bulk material into your garden, you run the risk of bringing things in with it that you don't want, right? So that could be weed seeds, that could be pathogen spores. Weed seeds in particular can be a real issue, especially with homemade compost. Or if you have a bad weed problem in your yard and you're using grass clippings, oftentimes people will transfer weeds from their turf into their vegetable garden that way. That can be really easy to do. The other thing that I've seen happen a lot in the 5 years since I worked here at K-State is that there are herbicides that people will use in pastures, and there's nothing wrong with them using them there. They're labeled for that and everything, but a lot of these herbicides are actually designed to have a very long residual activity period. So they work their way through the digestive system of the animal. They actually go through the decomposition process, and they're still active. And when you put this compost into your garden, it'll actually kill many of your vegetable crop plants. So it's a good idea, especially for home gardeners that aren't necessarily using a ton of compost. Be sure you're getting your compost from a reputable source, whether it's a municipality around usually has high quality compost, or if you're purchasing compost, they're going to be testing it for those things. When I see it be a problem is especially for our commercial growers that need a whole lot of it, and they go down the road to their neighbor's house and they get, a couple semi-truck loads of manure or compost or whatever, and they don't realize that there's herbicides in there as well, and you can really cause big problems that way. So be a little bit careful about that. The other thing to mention is, especially in areas with low rain amounts in the western part of the state, if you use compost over and over and over and over again, especially in high amounts, then you're actually going to over-fertilize that soil and build up saline soil conditions. In other words, high salt conditions in the soil. And you can test for this to make sure that's not going on. When you do your soil test, if you have the EC value done in the soil test, you can actually find out what the salinity of your soil is to find out if that's happened. It's not usually a huge problem for home gardeners. It's a big problem for commercial growers, especially people that are growing in high tunnels and protected culture areas, or if you're using low tunnels, and preventing rain, because one of the best ways to reduce soil salt buildup is actually just to get rain, right? And then, of course, we don't want to ever put anything that looks like this into the garden, right? Green manure has really no place in the garden. The USDA technically does allow manures to be used in vegetable production systems, but it's really not a good practice. So you want to make sure that stuff is being composted well. And don't forget, for those of us using grass clippings, that, if you have dogs and pets, they're going to be probably adding to some of the microbes in those grass clippings as well. Excuse me. So this is a picture of a garden that I helped a friend of mine build. It was several years ago, and this actually wasn't in Kansas. You can see this really nice red clay soil. It's pretty awesome. This garden was a new garden, and actually the house was over to the left of this picture, and there was a whole lot of wash that would come off of this part of the yard, flow across this area, and it just took what little soil, good soil that was on there, got totally washed away. And it was very highly compacted and eroded. And so what we went on to do is really, really quickly increase the organic matter of that soil, and also provide some good nutrients for the garden that we were going to put in. So in this case, we were actually making our own compost. And so we just added about, a pretty solid layer, about 3 to 4 inches of compost, and just tilled that in with a regular front tine or rear tine tiller in order to kind of disperse it into the soil so that the plants aren't trying to grow in pure compost. Now, this is homemade compost, as I mentioned before. We used, in this gentleman's house, I used to do a lot of landscaping, and so we would use a lot of brush material that we would chip up, from doing maintenance around the property, as well as a lot of grass clippings. And you can tell, if you look at this compost, you can't really tell what it is, right? It looks like compost, or it kind of looks like soil. And that's a good indicator that the compost is finished. If you start digging through your compost pile and you can identify individual items like banana peels and cherry tomato seeds and stuff like that, then it probably isn't quite done yet. But if you start digging through it and it's nice and dark, and you really don't recognize it as anything other than compost, then you probably should be good to go. Now, in this case, as I mentioned before, we really wanted to increase the organic matter. We really wanted to improve our soil health, and we wanted to provide a lot of beneficial microbes to this highly depleted soil. So we added a really, really heavy coating and then tilled it in. But you may actually not need as much as you think. If you have already fairly well-established soil and you just want to use that compost as a fertilizer source, it doesn't actually require as much as most people think it does. So this is a picture of a research trial that I took a few years ago. And what we were doing in this case, this was an organic research trial, and we were growing heirloom tomatoes. So heirloom tomatoes want about 100 pounds of nitrogen or a little more per acre. And I forget what the equivalent of that is in square footage. But we were actually applying, this is a chicken litter-based compost that we were applying at a rate that was equivalent to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And it's hard to tell in this picture, but if you were to actually go out there and stick your finger through there, you would not be able to measure the thickness of that compost. It is a paper-thin application. And so, I guess the take-home message here is you probably don't need as much compost as you think if you already have fairly well-established soil. So in addition to compost, there's other sources of plant nutrients you can use. I think most of us are pretty familiar with, typical synthetic fertilizers and water-soluble fertilizers. I think a lot of folks, I've had very good luck in my gardens using slow-release fertilizers. Some of these coated pellet fertilizers work really well and oftentimes come with micronutrients included as well too. So I've had really good luck with those. It is really important to make sure you're using micronutrients. Micronutrients aren't used in a large amount, but they're really important, and especially for vegetables. Many of them are really important for fruit quality, calcium and potassium in particular. Sorry, potassium is in the micronutrient, excuse me. But calcium in particular is really important in tomatoes for fruit quality. Similar magnesium can be really important. Boron and sulfur can be really important for fruit flavor. So you want to make sure you have some type of a source of micronutrients. And there's lots of different ways to do that. You can see some of these in this table that came out of your manual here. Many of these have lots and lots of micronutrients in terms of blood meal and bone meal. And then you can also buy synthetic ones as well too. Okay, so we're going to talk real quick about cover crops, and then we'll go ahead and take a break for questions. So cover crops are sort of a new thing for home gardeners, but it's really not a new technology at all. Before World War II, we actually used cover crops to fertilize most of our traditional agricultural fields. And what they basically are is it's plants that we grow in the off-season, and then we turn them back into the soil. We don't harvest them, and we allow the microbes that live in the soil to eat them. So we're really feeding the soil with cover crops instead of feeding ourselves. But I'd really encourage you to learn more about cover crops, and I'll show you a couple examples of some here that you can use in the home garden, and some that I've used before, because they really do have a lot of benefits. Not only increasing soil health and feeding that microbial community, but also to helping suppress weeds and provide fertilizer. And I'll show you how that works here in just a second. So you guys remember that picture, that 30 by 30 foot garden? This is another picture of it taken, probably around March 20th or so, which is actually a little bit late. I think this was the year I was writing my Ph.D. dissertation, and so I, of course, got my garden in a little bit later than I wanted to. But what this is actually a mixture of winter wheat and crimson clover, and this is annual crimson clover. And so it was planted somewhere around probably October 15th in that neighborhood. And then what's going to happen is during the course of the winter, that winter wheat is going to grow, and it's going to pick up nitrogen that's laying around in the soil. And we all remember from our soils class that nitrogen does not bind very tightly to soil particles, right? It's highly leachable, and it gets washed into the groundwater very quickly. So one of the things that we can do with cover crops is we can plant this winter wheat in the off season, and it's going to pick up that nitrogen before it has a chance to get washed away. Right? It's going to store that nitrogen in its shoots and leaves, and then in the spring we're going to mow it and we're going to till it in, and it becomes free fertilizer for your garden. Right? So this is one of the really nice benefits of using cover crops, is actually what we call nitrogen recovery. Rather than allowing that nitrogen to just be washed away during the wintertime and go into the groundwater, we can harvest it, right? We can collect it with these plants, and then we can turn it back into the soil in the spring and provide free fertilizer. The other thing that we're doing here is we're using a mixture of not only that winter wheat, but also annual crimson clover. And annual crimson clover is a leguminous plant, so it actually has a beneficial relationship with bacteria in its roots. And these bacteria actually turn atmospheric nitrogen into free fertilizer for the plants. And don't forget that our atmosphere is something like 78% nitrogen or some very high number like that. So we have lots of available nitrogen in the air, but only these bacteria can actually turn it into fertilizer. And they do this in leguminous plants. And so that's why we like to have mixtures of legumes as well as grasses when we use cover crops, because the grasses will recover the nitrogen that's laying around in the soil, and the legumes will actually what we call fix nitrogen, or in other words, deposit nitrogen into your garden system. Now we want to turn this cover crop in about 30 days prior to planting of our vegetable crops, so that those microbes that live in the soil have a chance to chew it up and release all that nitrogen back into the soil for the vegetable plants. And just FYI, a cover crop stand like this will provide more than enough nitrogen for most of our vegetable crops. We used to do we do a lot of sampling of cover crops in my research program, and we actually calculate the amount of nitrogen that goes back into the soil. And I can tell you just from experience, this is a really nice cover crop here. It's very thick. It's got good biomass to it. It's nice and green. I'm sure there's every bit of 85 pounds of nitrogen in there, which would be basically as much fertilizer as you need for a tomato crop. There's some other fun cover crops that are coming out these days as well too. This is one called tillage radish, and it's a really nice one to use in the home garden. Now it's a true fall cover crop, so it really needs to be planted really before September 1st, or more like August 15th if possible. And you can see what it's going to do is it's going to grow very quickly. It gets this nice big canopy where it's going to compete with the weeds for light and nutrients and water, and it's going to prevent those weeds from growing, essentially, just in the fact that it's very, very competitive. Now, at the same time that all this growth is going on above ground, this radish is going to develop below ground. And you can see they get very big. And this is actually not the biggest one I've seen. They get, almost the size of baseball bats sometimes. And it'll send a very deep taproot down into the soil, which is going to break up hard clay pan layers. And we call this biodrilling. And so that's one of the reasons that they actually call this the tillage radish, is because it will actually, drive down through some of these hard clay layers. Now, in addition to it just being a cool plant, I think one of the reasons why it's nice for home gardeners in particular is because it actually gets winter killed. Okay, so this plant is sensitive to, once we get about a 15-degree night, it's going to get totally frozen out. It actually smells kind of bad when it rots, so your neighbors are going to love you for that. And then it's going to leave these holes down into the soil where those radishes were, and that's going to allow oxygen and water to get there and help feed those microbes as well too. But one of the nice things about it is because it gets winter killed, this biomass is much easier to handle. You can essentially go in there in the spring and just till it in if you want to. Whereas with this wheat and crimson clover, you're going to have to get in there and mow it. And keep in mind that that's a pretty thick stand of biomass, so you're going to want to be careful about how you do that. You want to find somebody that has probably a gas-powered weed eater or even like a hedge trimmer or something like that to cut it down. If you know somebody with a sickle bar mower, those things are really great. But generally for a small plot like this, a gas-powered weed eater actually works about as good as anything. But these cover crops that get frozen in the wintertime are even easier to manage for home gardeners. So I kind of like to recommend those as sort of your gateway cover crops. And that includes tillage radish, but also another good one that it could include is spring oats. You can plant oats in the fall, and they'll get killed as well too. So this is that field where those tillage radishes were. And you can see, as I mentioned before, they are a true fall cover crop. So what was going on here is we actually had a row of tomatoes right here. And we really like to use fabric mulch back home and to help keep the weeds out. And so you can imagine when we planted the tillage radish on August 15th, we weren't ready to give up our tomatoes yet, obviously. They weren't done. And so the tomatoes were still here. And then at some point, probably in about October, we cleaned out that tomato row and we pulled up the fabric mulch, and it left this huge bare strip right here, right? So once that bare strip was exposed to sun, all of a sudden we started getting henbit everywhere. And henbit is a very common winter weed. It causes a lot of problems in vegetable gardens. It's a real pain in the butt because it's very low growing. It's not fun to pull or to try and kill. And henbit, like most weeds, is a colonizer. If you think about what weeds do in sort of the ecosystem of your garden, is typically they like disturbed soil. They like bare open spaces that they can colonize and take over, right? So one of the things that we want to do with cover crops is, keep in mind, you had this extremely competitive plant out here in the fall, right? And it was competing with those weeds. Well, when we had this bare soil here, those weeds come in and they're able to take that area over and colonize it. And of course, they're going to flower and they produce weed seeds that's going to lead to more weeds and more weeds and more weeds. So one of the ways that using cover crops really helps reduce weed pressure is that it kind of elbows the weeds out of the way, right? It keeps them from colonizing bare spaces and producing seeds and adding more to the weed seed bank. So if you're using cover crops and keeping that soil covered as much as possible with plants you can control, over time you'll have less pressure against the ones you can't. You can also do some other fun things with cover crops. This is what we would call a living mulch. So in this case, this was actually, I don't know if it was the same year, but in this case, we probably had tillage radishes mixed with crimson clover in the fall. And that crimson clover was able to grow through the wintertime. And you can see the crimson clover growing there. And then we just came in with a tiller and did strip tillage and put down some fabric. And then you have this nice living mulch left in the rows, right? And so that's really handy, not only to reduce compaction, but also to really help maintain good soil health in those row middles as you tracking back and forth through there. And of course, to help keep the mud out of mom and dad's house is always important. If you start looking on the internet about cover crops, one of the things you're going to see is a lot of folks like to recommend cereal rye, right? So cereal rye is, what they make bread and whiskey and beer and stuff out of. And it gets about 5 to 6 feet tall, depending on the soil and the weather conditions. And that's what this is over here on the right, where the arrow is. So I would not recommend using cereal rye in a home, in a home landscape, because that plant grows extremely fast. And once that stuff gets that tall, it can be really hard to manage. There's another summer cover crop called sorghum Sudan grass. It's an awesome, awesome cover crop if you have the right equipment to manage it. But if you don't, you really don't want to use that one in the vegetable garden. And there's some other fun things you can do. This would be a windbreak. So this is actually that cereal rye. And it grows a lot like winter wheat does. It just gets a lot taller. And in this case, what we did was we actually used strip tillage through the rye and then planted summer squash through there. And that just helps keep that really stiff wind off of those transplants and those young plants when they're just germinating. Okay, so let's take a break for questions. I'm already a little behind schedule. So why don't we just take a little break away from the PowerPoint and have about a 10-minute question and answer session. So that was a lot of information there. Did the audio and video come through okay?
Yeah, I think it went good. So yeah, we do have one question. We'll have to see if you can hear it. If not, I'll repeat it.
Okay.
I'm talking about the cover crops. Now you had the wheat and the clover together. Now in an area where we don't get a lot of rain, isn't that taking the available moisture out of the ground? So we actually have less moisture in the spring to plant with?
Yep, it can. And especially for, like in the world of row crops and larger scale ag, that's one of the kind of issues with cover crops. But with vegetable crops, there's not much point in planting a garden unless you plan to irrigate it. So it doesn't really cause an issue in the garden. It may pull a little bit of soil moisture out of there, but what it provides in organic material and other things like that, it's going to be worth it, the trade-off, I think. But yeah, it's definitely a good question. And it's a challenge, for like a lot of people are promoting cover crops for like wheat growers and corn growers, and you go to parts of western Kansas, or if you get into like eastern Washington, some of those areas, they don't get enough rain really to be able to do it, right?
Okay, yep.
If I were to plant the cereal rye, first, what time of year would I plant that? And then I have the machinery if I wanted to do the rows later and plant seedlings or squash or whatever. But then when would I cut down the cereal rye that I'm using for like a windbreak?
Right, I gotcha. So any of your winter cover crops, and it will include rye. I really like winter wheat in home garden, but if you have the equipment, then no problem with rye. They're going to be planted, the very latest you want to plant them is, I've pushed it till November 1st. You're really not supposed to. You really want to hit somewhere between September 15th and October 15th if you can. So those are, October 15th is a good one to shoot for. I know I'm always a little slow to get my tomatoes cleaned out in the fall. Like to wait till it's cool. And then in terms of the spring, so what's going to happen with that rye, and winter wheat does the same thing, is it's going to germinate in the fall and it's going to just sort of head up. You guys are probably pretty familiar with what wheat does out there. And then at some point around March 10th or 15th, depending on the weather, it's going to start to grow really fast, right? And start shooting up really tall. So you could actually go in and mow it periodically to help keep it short and keep it from getting unruly. But in your case, if you're wanting to use it as a windbreak and just let it grow up, I would actually just let it grow. There's a couple different schools of thought there. If you let it continue to grow and grow and grow, eventually the seed that's left behind will become viable, right? You'll have rye seed in those seed heads, and it'll brown down, and it is a cool season plant. So, by June 1st or so, it'll turn brown, probably earlier than that in your region. It'll turn brown and dry up just like wheat does. And what I would do actually in that case is I wouldn't mow it. I would actually just lay it over. I mean, if you want to do something similar to that picture, you can almost just go in with like a big oil barrel or something and just kind of smash it down. Or, you can always just use a 2x4 or something, and just lay that stuff over, because the more you chop it up, the more it's going to degrade really quickly. And so it's not going to provide as much mulch, because it's going to decompose faster the more you chop it up. So you might be better to just lay it over once it gets brown. Now, if you want to try and kill it before those seed heads turn viable, and with rye and wheat, what you can do is you can actually crack open the seed heads and find out if they've turned hard yet. And as long as you kill them before we call the soft dough stage, it's when they're kind of flexible. You can mow it, and we use a thing called a flail mower that works really well. And you can use hedge trimmers, like the big sickle bar hedge trimmers. So you got a couple different options there. If you're able to do it, without killing the vegetable plants, you can also use glyphosate, like Roundup or one of those kinds of things to kill it. A lot of people will do that as well too.
Thank you.
Anybody else got any questions or?
Yeah, I have a quick one. I'm not going to be a big gardener. I'm just going to be one of those that just, one or two tomato plants, a couple peppers. Is there anything, because I was thinking about planting in the middle of my flower beds. And is there anything I need to watch out for that? And also, you talk about your tillage radish. Is that something I can put around my bushes to kind of help give them extra fertilizer?
Yeah, those are good questions. So when you asked earlier about the flower beds, are you asking, are there any interactions between vegetable plants and flowers that could cause a problem?
I'm really not too worried about the interactions between flowers. I'm just wondering, because when they get planted in my flower beds, they're going to get more water.
Oh,
And
sure.
I have big square areas clear in the back of my yard, which I have to string 200 feet of hose back there. They're not going to get watered.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I don't think you would have a problem there. I mean, most of those things, depending on what type of flower beds you have, I mean, are they in raised beds?
No, they're not raised beds.
They're not raised beds. Okay. Usually having too much water isn't a big problem in central Kansas. So I wouldn't think you'd be in too much problem there. And then your second question was about tillage radishes. And now I've forgotten what it was. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just wondering if I planted it around where my shrubs are. And,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
Sure. I mean, it's going to help. One of the things that's cool about that plant is it sends those roots really deep, and it's going to pull up nutrients for the other plants to gain access to. And it's going to, you know, like I said, drill little holes through that clay and all that kind of stuff. I have been known to plant cover crops in flower beds myself. So yeah, I'd say go ahead and do it. Why not? Be kind of fun. You might have some neighbors that'll be happy with you, but any other questions?
Anybody else? Don't forget, if you need to get a snack, get up and grab it. I mean, we're kind of going to have a couple of these question and answers. So if you do need to get up, feel free to make stuff ready for us in the back, as far as if you need another little snack to carry you through.